trying to, get some, mind strength there, and some of the drugs that the president has taken, because he now feels 20 years younger, from what I understand. But I was reading a scholarly article from Georgetown Law about the Declaration. So we're going to kind of dig deep on this, and I guess one of the first things, and this scholar from Georgetown, he made an interesting argument. He argues that the Declaration is our founding document. It's the Constitution. None of that is nearly as important as the Declaration. Would you guys agree with that? That of all the founding documents, and Tim, you've explored probably more than all of us, that it stands heads and tails above all the others and sets out the foundations of our government with more clarity than anything else?
Well, I might jump ship on the clarity part of your statement. I think, I do think, well, I mean, if Lincoln thinks it's important and foundational, I'll go with Abe. So I think there is something to that. Now, I mean, just the second paragraph alone is enough to, and as we all know, I mean, it's a great paraphrase of Locke, but so yeah, I would certainly consider it to be as important as the Constitution. I don't know. I guess I've always kind of seen them in tandem, not necessarily one bigger than the other. So yeah, just the principle of equality and consent and rights are just monumental concepts that we've wrestled with as a nation. So yeah, I think it deserves to be considered the most important document.
Tim, let me ask you a question, because I'm not going to disagree with you, but today I think maybe and for us now, right? But at the time, would you have said that maybe like common sense was a more pivotal right?
Oh, sure.
At the founding and leading up to the revolution.
Sure. Yeah, I mean it sold the most. I mean, it's unbelievable amount of sales. If you calculated, if it was a New York Times list today, it'd be how many times over. So yeah, I mean, common sense was widely read. I mean, in early American history, it was customary for towns to have public celebrations in the middle of the town squares and the Declaration to be read, from the beginning to the very end. It was a part of the liturgy, as one historian has called it, the liturgy of the Fourth, to read the Declaration. So it was definitely front and center in the celebrations of the Fourth in the early Republic. So yeah, common sense and the Declaration are. Thankfully, the Declaration is of a length that you can read in one sitting. I don't know if all 45 pages of common sense would be a little stretch, but sure, Paine's common sense is also notable. But as far as a founding document, I think it probably is a bit different than the Declaration or the Constitution.
Well, I mean, the Declaration is great poetry, but let me ask you this. Does it in any way, shape, or form have, and I think we've maybe talked about this a little bit before, does it have any element or force of law? I mean, again, Mike, you're the trained lawyer. I mean, could you go into a courtroom and reference the Declaration of Independence as a legal argument, unless you're Matt Damon in some great movies?
Well, no, I mean, you can reference it as part of your opening and closing, I guess, but no, you can't. It doesn't provide any real enforceable rights.
Well, does it set out a clarity of our political system, or political theory? Is it, in that sense?
I wouldn't say clarity. I'd say broad outlines in terms of consent rights and equality. The end goal. But clarity, I think I don't know that a declaration of independence in the middle of any war would be. I think it'd be ill-advised to try to be real clear, frankly. So I think it hits a sweet spot in vagueness for its purpose.
Mike, you were going to say.
Well, I mean, this just building off Dave, I think you sent us the Joseph Ellis piece this weekend. So
Yeah.
we're kind of asking, is the Declaration the most foundiest of the founding documents kind of question?
Hope you know I kind of set that as a poking Tim to poke John Kaminsky, because I don't know if you saw the beginning. He seemed to imply that he was chosen to write it because he's delved into the founding documents more than anybody else.
Oh yeah, no.
I don't know if you caught that.
Yeah.
I immediately went, "Oh my God!" And I wasn't going to send it directly to Kaminsky, but I value my life, so. Yeah.
So I mean, the question, and you brought up this article from Georgetown Law. I guess I don't know who's our audience when we ask if it sets out the structure of the government. Are we talking about the political elites back at the time? Are we thinking? Are you wanting us to ask? Should
American citizens
today,
in general.
but it might be different answers depending on who. For me, it might be different answers depending on would I want Americans today to look at the Declaration and think about providing clarity for the type of government we have? I don't think so. I think at the time, I think that was a document. It was an interesting document, right? Because it was political elites are taking a lot of risk in that document, but at the same time, they need to write it in a way where they can read it out in public squares and get people excited about not just the Declaration itself, but that we are going to go to war and try to make this thing happen. So it's serving multiple purposes at the time that I think are probably, for me, more important than it serves today. I guess that's the argument I'll make, and we'll see how quickly people can pounce on that. But yeah.
Well, I agree with you. Time frame matters. That's why I asked about common sense. But I've brought this up before, and I'm going to go with Tim on this. I'm not sure that I would use the word vague. I would say broad. This broad description of the role and purpose of government, right, to secure rights, and that when the government doesn't secure these rights, then you have the right to alter or abolish it. So this is broad, social contract idea laid out within the Declaration. And I think it actually does. I think it is important for different groups. And I think I've talked about, Malcolm X on this very broadcast. And the idea is that, is this a one and done kind of idea? So when there's been a long train of abuses and usurpations, right, as evidence for, and we're talking about right now in the Black Lives Matter protests, do you have the right to alter or abolish the government? I think that's a valid question. I think so. If we're going to say that this is I'm the Georgetown professor's piece, I've not seen it, but that if we're going to hold true to this, then these are values that should transcend time, right? And so we should be able to pull those values in, no matter where we are in time, to say, listen, is the government actually fulfilling its role? And is that government truly based on the consent of the people? Because a legitimate government is based on consent.
But Mike raised the issue of audience. I think there's to kind of take the total opposite view and kind of deconstruct all of this is I think
Akil Amar.
Yes. Yeah, I know. I feel kind of dirty, but there's an argument to be made that the audience, Mike, you mentioned audience, who in a contemporary audience, but I think at the time there was this question like, who was Jefferson writing this for? Is he writing it for the neutral people in the United States? Was he writing it to the supporters in Parliament? I mean, you look at the Parliament votes during that window of time, about 1/4 to 1/3 on every vote they have are pro-colonial. So one of the arguments is that the Declaration is blaming the monarch so as to not alienate those supporters in Parliament. There's also an argument that it's written to the French aristocrats, resonating with, in the natural rights theory, or plain and simple, it's just a give us some money plea to the French monarch. So, if indeed those are the competing audiences at the time, that doesn't make the Declaration anything remotely close to an important foundational document. It means it's a polemic essay for immediate support with those constituencies in mind. So I think it may have, at the time, I'm not sure I could go so far as to say it was. It certainly has become, but at the time, I think there's multiple views as to what actually was going on when it was written and for what purpose.
And I know it's dangerous to try to get really into the mind of these people, especially Jefferson, somewhat similar to trying to get in the mind of Trump in many ways. Do you think he was writing for posterity's sake?
Wait a minute, did you just equate Thomas Jefferson with Donald Trump?
Yeah.
We'll let that go.
Crickets. I like it in the sense that not in the sense of of the authoritarian elements, although I think we all have probably some authoritarian leanings, but in the sense that he's not exactly a machine of consistency, all right, and that he is very, very concerned about public opinion, all right, his own self-image. We know that. And again, although for much of my life I was a big Jefferson fan, probably the last 15 years that's changed an awful lot in the sense that he seems to be writing in many of his works worried about how he's going to be judged rather than voicing fundamental principles there. So my question though is, do you think, Tim, he was writing as well as for those various audiences, which I think you're right. I think he is trying, he is writing, and not just Tim, but they are sending out this message to all of these different groups. But do you think he's also writing for posterity's sake?
I don't know. I think he hopes so. I think he does sincerely believe that American independence is the right thing to do. I don't know whether a lot of them, how they write each other is interesting. They know that some of their letters are going to be taken in the mail and read and stolen and purloined and circulated. And so some of their letters, their private letters, they know are going to be public. And so they're kind of guarded in some of those letters. And then there's some letters that they have to their real close friends where they really actually say what they think. And I think that demonstrates that they do kind of have an eye to the future, especially, and they're guarded in some letters and not guarded in others. And so they do know, that's one of the reasons they burn their wives' letters. To not have posterity go. Well, Jefferson burned his wife's letters. Washington, John Adams is the only one that didn't. But James Monroe as well. He burned all his wife's letters. So I think there is an element that they do look to the future, that they were in a historic moment, and I think they realize that to some degree.
Well, to what extent? And there's a group, and I'll call it the Academy, that has laid out this argument that it is propaganda. It is pure political propaganda at the time to achieve political purposes, filled with great poetry, of which it's very, very fragile principles.
Well, I think this goes back to what Mike brought up originally. Who's the audience, right? And then Tim kind of clarifies there are multiple audiences, and I think that I think, isn't there even a question in the textbook that asks who is the intended audience, right? Which is so broad. But I do think there is a degree of like, John Sixpack colonist is going to have to pick up a musket and fight, right? So you got to give them something to fight for. I think there's a little bit of truth in that, but I don't think it's purely a propaganda document. I think it's and that this maybe is giving Jefferson too much credit, because I'm with you, Dave, on my evaluation of Jefferson. He was a politician through and through, right? So he has like almost two spheres in his brain working. My implication was that our current president actually has a brain. That was my problem.
That's a fair one.
So I think, what he said, it was a statement. Didn't he say it was help me on this, Timmy, that it was a statement, and this was later in the 1820s, that was a statement of the American mind at the time.
Yeah, nothing original, nothing new, just a statement of general sentiments.
Right, and that we know that those sentiments have been expressed up and down the 13 colonies as well, or not all 13 colonies, but there have been that type of sentiment, that type of writing going on at the colonial level. I would encourage the students, especially for you, one kids that are working on this question, to pick up Pauline Mayer's
Yes.
American Scripture. Is a fantastic work looking at the concept of the Declaration being called an American Scripture. But I do think, Dave, I think there is some credence to the idea that it's going to be there's propaganda in a way. It's it's an Uncle Sam poster, if you will, of I want you. So this is one of the reasons why it was made to be read in the village green, right in the middle of the town, as a somewhat of a recruiting tool.
I mean, for me, it's the Declaration is like it's a breakup letter, right? To me, it's less about saying what the new government's going to look like and more, here are the reasons we got to call this thing off, kind of thing. And what's interesting to me, Chris, I think already brought up Lincoln. Like,
it was Timmy.
I'm sorry, was Tim you brought up Lincoln? Okay. To think about its implications in real political crisis. So it's like the Confederates, they bring it up and they say, hey, this is our justification to break up. And Lincoln says, no, that's not going to work. That argument's not valid. Interestingly, Martin Luther King uses the Declaration, but not as a breakup. He uses it as, let's live up to our aspirations of being this people, right? So it just makes me think today, in our current environment, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Antifa or the Proud Boys, what if they look back to the Declaration and say, here's our right to, violently overthrow the government because we are not being ruled by the consent of the governed? Would it have that kind of like power today to get people to think that their actions are justified based on our history together? I know there was a lot there. I'm just trying to link it to present.
I would certainly say that maybe the Proud Boys or Second Amendment type folks that adhere to the idea of holding on to your guns in case a tyrannical government was to come in and somehow usurp your rights. But I think it's hard to say that your average white guy living in rural North Dakota that owns thousands of dollars worth of firearms is going to have a lot of his rights usurped.
But Chris, if it is the foundational document, is it justified? Is it the right reading of the document? I should have weapons and I should be ready to fight against a tyrannical government.
Well, I think so. Good luck though with your AR-15 knockoff and their drone missiles. That's probably a one-sided fight. But I think that it goes back to the idea of trying to figure out what that long train of abuses and usurpations are, right?
Right.
And I think if you look at the letter from Birmingham jail,
Right.
King lays that argument out in that document as well about this, but his course is to do it nonviolently. Go ahead, Timmy. I'm sorry.
Well, let's not forget that during the Continental Congress, when they're meeting, nearly everybody's willing to fight. British people fight. They fight their government. That's British history. When the government steps out of line, the king gets his gun. There are civil wars in British history. So there's a history of violence Um, but and even in the Continental Congress, there are many people willing to fight. It's just now for independence. So there's that. So there's that division within the Continental Congress. It's one thing to fight for your rights, to parte. It's another. It's another to fight for independence. And so that long train of abuses is interesting because the Brit could say that very easily. There's a long train of abuses and we're trying to right the ship and stay within the British system versus here's a long train of abuses and we want to jump ship. I mean, that's a remarkably, that's a bridge too far for many people. And remember, many people would argue that this is really a moot point because the king did it when he in 75 when he declared that the colonies were in a state of rebellion. So many colonials, when that happened in 75, felt like there was really no recourse other than independence because they were now thrown into this theoretical state of nature outside the protection of the crown. And frankly, and Pauline Maier, I'm glad you raised that book, Chris, because it's a fantastic book. I mean, there's something like 200 declarations of independence in America before the Declaration of Independence. Counties and cities, and there's a New York Bridge Club that has a Declaration of Independence, and so there's, so is it no? Maybe the New York Bridge Club is the most important declaration document in American history.
She's got a great line in there with Lincoln, and I can never get the quote exactly right. That the Lincoln and using the Declaration of Independence and how he uses it at that time frame, and she says something that. He took an old wine and put it in a new vessel, and poured this out. And it's much more poetic than I can remember it. But if the students listening to this, get that book, find that quote in there, and commit that one if you're talking about the Declaration, because it will really help you when you. And as Mike talked about earlier, taking that Declaration through time and its application through time, especially looking at the Civil War. So, Mike, can I ask you a question? So how would you you listed off some groups. How would you go to people like for Black Lives Matter? And I saw this, a group of African-American folks heavily armed on a social post, a media post. It's the NFAC, right? The Not Around Club, I think is what they call themselves. And they're heavily armed Black folks. And you guys, three of us are old enough to remember the Black Panthers in California, which got Ronald Reagan as governor to support gun control. But what would you say to people, whether it be, a militant Black Lives Matter, Antifa, or the Proud Boys, that you're wrong using the Declaration of Independence?
I think my argument would be that the distinction between, if we're going to use the founding period as the model, that at that time that we had at best sort of indirect representation, that there were laws being made, futures being cast of which we had no control over. And today we have the opportunity through nonviolent means, through a political process, to have your voice heard. And that it's not the same train of abuses that you can use to make that argument.
Well, and I'd like to respond, or kind of address something that Mike said, about the living notion of the Declaration. Doesn't it get trumped by the Constitution? I mean, this long train of abuses, it's a snapshot. It may be justified in 1776, but when we look at this so-called right to revolution or alter and abolish, when we get to the Constitution, there's no language like that. They toss it out. So from that point on, Chris, I don't think any group can use the Declaration as a justification of violent revolution, because the document that forms the American identity, all right, in a legal sense, is the Constitution. And the Constitution does not grant us a right to revolution. It does allow us to alter, all right? And, and I've read some, articles that say that the amendment process going through the states and a convention would allow us to remove that contract of 1787, 89 or whatever, and form a new one. But I don't think any group can use this language because that language isn't in the Constitution, which is the language, which is the document that really forms our identity as a nation.
Well, yeah, and Lincoln adds to that too. His first inaugural is a large section of it is a marriage analogy. He uses covenantal language that we can't divorce. So he adds almost like this cultural religious component to the Declaration, and I don't know that I buy that argument, but he ups the ante certainly that the Declaration is much more than just this potential legal framework. It actually what we've done with it is we've created a marriage, and you can't leave. And he also says, look, everybody has to agree to end the marriage, not
Right.
just you.
Yeah.
And so that may be a critical missing piece, I think, to the Black Lives Matter or Antifa. Look, I mean, every state legislature before the National Declaration of Independence had their own versions of the Declaration of Independence, or they wrote constitutions. That's an interesting thing to think about. Before we even have a Declaration of Independence, there are states writing their own new state constitutions. Are those declarations of independence? So there's a lot of pre-rebellion stuff going on before the Declaration is actually constructed. And there's a lot of bottom-up. This is Pauline Mayer's point in that book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of bottom-up input that goes on before the National Continental Congress gets around to doing this poetic piece. So there's a lot of bottom-up that I'm not quite convinced we have right now in the streets.
Well, let me just, Dave, I definitely agree with you in your assessment about the Constitution. It's not in there. And just for the students listening to this, remember, we're four guys, three of us pretty getting up in the years, one of us not so much. And don't shake your head, young man.
Well, I'm just tired of being called an old fart. I mean, it hurts. It hurts. It could be true, but it hurts.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, it's the brutal mirror of reality.
When you know who Joe Cocker is, you're
when you know who Graham Funk is.
yeah.
Yeah.
But my point is that, I granted in theory, in this nice, comfy environment that we're all sitting in right now, talking about this theory. If I'm a person that's stockpiling weapons because I believe the government is the enemy, I'm not going to stop myself and go, oh, wait, I can't do this because the Constitution doesn't really say that I can, so I better not. I better not. We're talking about theory, we're talking about law, and it's nice in a textbook, but where the rubber meets the road,
Yeah.
if I'm stockpiling weapons, whether I'm Proud Boys or NFAC or whoever that is, I'm going to find a way to justify it.
Right. And this is, I think, for the students, I think you need to think about this because of how complicated and multifaceted the U.S. history is. And that, if you're uninformed, you could pull on different threads of history and make pretty compelling arguments. And Chris's point is absolutely right. The four of us aren't going to maybe buy the argument, or the four of us could make this argument, right? But to someone who, whether they're a Black person or a white person, who can look back and give empirical data about how they think they've been mistreated, that distinction is not going to matter. And what they do have is in our myth making about ourselves, we have this idea about the Declaration, right? That it provides rights, but it also gives us the right to abolish government. I mean, I think that resonates with people, whether it's correct or not. And the fact that it's in our history makes us maybe a little different than Australians or Mexicans, right? There's different things that people can pull on that makes it, I don't know, just interesting to pay attention to.
Do South Africans have this discussion about what's our founding document? I know the history is so different, but do they wrestle with foundational documents the way we might?
That's a good question, Timmy. And they do a little bit. Of course, South Africa is a majority Black, so 80% of the population is Black. And there was something that was created by the African National Congress in 1955 called the Freedom Charter.
Yeah. Okay.
And the Freedom Charter was kind of much more than the Declaration. It actually did provide a blueprint of a lot of positive rights that then the Constitution then sort of makes legally enforceable. But the Freedom Charter also had it's kind of the same debate, a little more fiery language in it than the South African Constitution. So if you are someone who wants the South African government currently to do more, then you would make the argument, we're not living up to our Freedom Charter. Our founders were a bunch of sellouts in 94, 96. They didn't do enough, because the Freedom Charter says that that the industry should be nationalized. And they point to that and they say, we did everything but that, meaning we did nothing, because you've given me the right to vote, and it's 30 years later and I'm still living in a shack. So what's the point? Like, let's nationalize the mines and give me the wealth, right? So it is kind of a similar dynamic. It's just it's closer in time, right? Rather than 1776, it's 1955.
Do you think South Africans are well served to consider a 1955 document as their foundational document? Well, or maybe broadly, is any culture served well to claim, here's our foundational document?
That's a good question.
What do you mean by, can you explain, what do you mean by, are they well served? What do you mean by that?
Can I?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking, let's think about this, like if Old Testament Jewish culture, they could always point to the document, this is who we are, this is our document, and it gives us an identity. So I just wonder, carrying forward, whether that framework carries through to the positive or to the negative, to be able to identify.
To add on to that, Mike, I mean, our love affair and infatuation with our founding documents in some ways seems to lock us in a box. That we're supposed to rely on 18th century white guys who have no iota of an understanding of the world we inhabit, yet we're supposed to rely on their sage wisdom and insights into a political process. To me, that's the danger of this love affair with founding documents. I
completely agree. And I would my argument would be, if our national identity is one of a civic nature, then what brings us together is a belief in certain common principles. And if you start saying our common principles aren't that common, it feels like the whole thing just kind of goes away, and it leaves space for folks to say, we're not about common principles, we're about being a white, English-speaking Christian nation. I mean, that argument is much easier to do without a founding document, because you just look around and you can see who belongs and who doesn't. But because we're trying to base this on this idea of a belief in principles, when we start saying Declaration doesn't matter, this part of the Constitution doesn't matter, I don't know, it feels like it kind of just all falls apart.
Are we doing Unit 6 now? Are we doing?
I don't know. See, Unit 1 and Unit 6 students.
Remember,
Unit 1 and Unit 6 are
sister units. What's interesting is we've been talking about principles. What I find fascinating is the question asks us to get into the grievances.
Yes.
And to what degree do the grievances set up a foundation for the legal system? And I'm curious if any of you did some homework and actually looked at the grievances and tried to do a match game there.
I didn't do a match game, but I do think that's a better argument. I think that's a great question that was constructed by the center, to think about that maybe the grievance list is a constitution in reverse.
I'd like to know who the author was.
He may be. No, it's not. No. I can't throw him under the bus, but he's a very knowledgeable man. So.
Well, I'm sure all the people who helped write this are knowledgeable there.
I don't know about that. I know one of them's
several
not.
of them are. Several.
After last year, after last year's questions, I did have some severe questions about who wrote these things. Anyway, so can you?
But again, the grievance list is just straight out of British form. I mean, the grievance list appears in all the great British documents in the 1600s. You know, they blame the king for all kinds of stuff, and they list them down, and they claim it's a violation of their constitution. So I think it is kind of a constitution in the reverse sense that these powers, you've abused these powers, and that's all about constitution making.
Well, can somebody clarify for me what the question is specifically asking? Because it says, do these grievances serve as a foundation for the U.S. Constitution? Do they mean foundation of the text or foundation of just the Constitution itself in a broader sense? I was a little bit squishy on what is it exactly asking. I mean, do they want us to find a clause in the Constitution that directly relates to one of the grievances? Is that what it's asking?
I think you can do the match game question, David, is to use your language.
Yeah.
And you can also, I mean, and I don't know that you will find this so much in the list of grievances as much as you might find it in terms of in the opening paragraphs and the structure of government with its limited, right? But I think you can do both with the question, honestly. That I know it says specifically in the grievances, and I would probably not only look at some personal guarantees are provided for in the body of the Constitution, say jury trial in Article 3, which is certainly a big issue with in the founding period, as we know, with admiralty courts and those types of things. Admiralty courts for the students, or this is when the colonists, the British could not get convictions in the colonies, and so they're putting the colonists accused of crimes on a boat and taking them up to Nova Scotia to stand trial, or back to England to stand trial in the Admiralty courts because they couldn't get convictions in Boston. So you see that right to jury trial protected in the body of the Constitution in Article 3. So you can play the match game with that, but also there's the structural sense. But I don't know, I would defer to Tim on this and say, could you make that argument based upon the list of grievances about the structure?
Sure. I mean, there's a federalism principle very early. He if I remember right, he's accusing the king of messing with colonial governors. So there's a federalism principle.
There's a representation principle, because I mean,
absolutely. He's messed with legislatures, put them in inconvenient places. He's interfered with immigration laws. I mean, so there's all kinds of power statements in the list of grievances that clearly show up in the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, but it's interesting, right? Because it seems to me the grievances are saying, this is my understanding, Tim, and all of you, I might be wrong on this. We have grievances because there are certain principles under British constitutional law.
Right.
You're not, so representation. Well, okay, representation is important, but when we get to the Constitutional Convention, we know that representation takes a lot of time to hash out. So I don't know if what they're raising are just at the time sort of the common sense, this is the way the social contract is, versus the Constitution has to deal with, okay, there's 13 states now.
Right.
How are we going to divvy up the representation? I don't think the Declaration gets us closer to that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would. Yeah, they're traditional British grievances. You know, there was the statement about standing armies.
Right.
Well, obviously, the Constitution deals with that in Article 1, Section 8. In the middle section, there's a whole bunch of military statements about congressional control of the military. So, yeah, they are. I mean, you're right, Mike. These are traditional British grievances, but they certainly are addressed in the constitutional structure as well.
But remember this too, though. I mean, as Tim already pointed out, states had already been constitution writing for a while when this came out. So we're fast forwarding from the document here to 11 years in the future when these guys are meeting in Philly trying to get it taken care of. So when Jefferson's writing this, I don't think he has his eye towards a future meeting in Philadelphia for a constitution.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and I've alluded to the last paragraph before about free and independent states. They're independent of each other as well. So
Right, right.
I mean, there's even, if I remember in the list of grievances, there's even an economic statement, like he's interfered with our trade. I mean, so there's commercial statements in the list of grievances too. So and that, I would say that was directly addressing mercantile control.
Right. There's I mean, there's a lot of separation of powers and rule of law statements. Again, you talked about, intervening in the legislative process, but they also complain about, the judicial process and where the king is. So I think there's a lot of both, principles there. And I think you're pointing out there's also, again, a match game you can play with clause in the Constitution and specific references in this list of grievances there. Do you find, to what degree are these lists legitimate, or is this list legitimate? To what degree is Jefferson stretching things?
Well, you got to remember he had a bunch of editors too, right? So, I mean, he has some help once he submits his, I mean, if you look at his original draft that he submits to Congress, the Continental Congress, they're gonna carve it up a little bit for him. So do you think, I'm sorry?
Because
they can, because they want to get their, they want to get their digs in on certain things. They feel like somehow the king there's been an affront to them and their colony. So they want to make sure they get that in there. So the question is, how much of this is a stretch?
90% of these grievances start off with the phrase "he has." That doesn't seem legitimate to me, given the structure of government in England in 1775.
Right, but that's also that's to the point where he's writing it to moderates in Parliament, so he's got to blame the king. But remember, before the last paragraph, he makes this. If I remember, it's the second to last paragraph. We said we've been pissing and moaning for 15 years. We've used the Great British Petition, the right of petition, over and over and over, going back into the 1760s. So I guess I'm taking a little bit of umbrage, David, to your. Is any of these gripes? Are any of those list of grievances legit? I would say yeah, because they've had 15 years of doing what good British people do, and that's they're exercising the petition right.
I don't question the content of the grievance. I question the target. Now,
sure.
That's where the politics come in. I think it's basic psychology. To blame Parliament is to blame a mass body. All right, it's much easier to blame a singular individual, which is why in our system, presidents get the blame and the benefit, and the applause kind of stuff. And we don't like Congress, we don't like Congress. We like our own congressman for the most part there. But so it's basic psychology. But I do think it brings into question some of the motives here and whether or not it is just such a treasured foundational document, because there are politics and propaganda going on if we understand the political system for what it is in 1775.
Well, but I also think Jefferson, maybe to give him a little shout out here, George III wanted to restore all the royal prerogatives that earlier kings had. So I think when in a really perverse way, I think what Jefferson may be doing is say, okay, George, you want to be like the original Stuart Kings? All right. He has. You want to be the big boy with the big pants? You're going to get so in a way, he may be taking George's argument that he wants to be king in Parliament as well as king. He might be taking him seriously on that and saying, all right, we'll take your argument. You suck. Over and over and over. So I think Jefferson might be pretty sophisticated here in blaming him on his own terms, on his own desired terms, I guess.
And I think, Dave, I agree with you to a point too, that it is a great propaganda technique. It's much easier for people to focus their attention on one person than this nebulous body called Parliament. Plus, you don't want to as Timmy said, you don't want to piss off the people that are supporting us or that may support what we do. They do have friends there, right? Edmund Burke, I think, being one of them to a degree, but but it is. I mean, I keep thinking, and when I've talked about this with my class, I always think about that. I hate to do this, but I think about Mein Kampf and the single devil theory. It's much easier to get people to focus their attention on one group or one person, and to get them riled up. And so if you're trying to fan the flames of getting Joe Sixpack Collins to pick up a musket, let's talk about the king and his tyrannical behavior.
And remember, there are many loyalists that can't go to independence because the king is the only thing that unites those diverse colonies. So in a way, he may be wanting to blame the king to really put it in the face of those wavering loyalists, those reluctant revolutionaries.
That's a great point.
Your guy has done this, he's done this, he's done this. The very thing that you claim holds us together is actually a tyrant. So I think the blaming of the monarch, I think at face value looks to be misplaced, but I think there's a lot of sophistication going on there.
But this sounds, I have a strong sense of presentism listening to you explain that to me.
Whoa. Wait, no, I take umbrage, dear sir.
Well, I just, we can perhaps focus our frustration or attention on a single person and not the enablers.
Oh, I don't think I said that. No. I think I kept it back then and saying that the loyalists at the time.
My own personal filters. I'm talking about my own personal filters.
Okay.
So I think if I'm trying to recollect in our first couple of discussions on Unit 1, but again, the Declaration tends to be framed within the natural rights philosophy. But kids are also asked to what degree does this reflect Republican theory? And if I remember correctly, the first paragraph, at least in a classical view, is very Republican. As far as identity, when one people want to separate from another people. It's also a very polite way to say, go stick it where the sun don't shine. I don't know if there's ever been a more polite expression of separation by anybody, which seems to be a reflection of virtuous principles. But other than that opening paragraph being maybe a reflection of virtue and Republican identity, is there any other area where you would direct kids to say, this reflects Republican principles, not necessarily natural rights principles?
Well, I would say his use of the word happiness. Life, liberty, and he doesn't say property, he says pursuit of happiness. I mean, all you have to do is read Aristotle very quickly, and his point is that in his taxonomy, it doesn't really matter which form is out there, as long as the happiness of the people is the end result. So I think it's interesting to think that maybe pursuit of happiness may be a slight tip of the hat to Republican principles, that government, the goal of government is to produce happiness amongst the people. Now, the weird thing about it is he says people have a role in creating that happiness, not necessarily the government. But it is interesting to me that he uses a classical Republican Aristotelian term of happiness in the rights.
Yeah, and I would just add, as I'm looking at the grievances, I know Tim and Chris and Dave, you have these memorized. I don't. But
yeah.
The first one is this idea of refusing to assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, which I think is maybe tipping the cap to republicanism. And then in my very kind of strained logic, the very last one, 27, he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction. In a weird way, if republicanism is this idea of trying to have people think of themselves as homo in a very sort of like everyone in common, that looking at the merciless Indian savages is a way to sort of bring us together.
Well, that's all about Lord Dunmore's proclamation when they offered freedom to the slaves to fight against their masters. So So I think that's probably a direct correlation to the Dunmore Proclamation.
Tim, I wanted to ask:
Wait, Dave, can I add one more?
Right.
And I mentioned this before, in a previous broadcast, is up above before you get into the he hases and he hases, right? Where it talks about it is their right, it is their duty. Jefferson's talking about what you have the right to do. And I think it's interesting that he does use the word duty. I think that a very classical Republican sense of obligation. So not only is it me, is it my right, if you want to go to the natural rights idea, but it's a classical Republican idea to say it is your duty as a citizen, as you need to do this. So I think that's one that just that word duty, I think is.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Being the Marxist beardian that I am, do you guys find anything nefarious about Tim's observation of going from Locke's right to property to pursuit of happiness? I
find lots of things nefarious about Tim, and I don't know we have time on this broadcast, but I don't think so. I think this is. I mean, we know that property was huge to these guys. Property was where it was at, and it was about the preservation of property. And
if it's so huge, why don't they say it?
Well, I think he doesn't need to. Well, part of it here, let me go back to this. And this is a thing that I kind of bring out in my classes. I've talked about this. So if he's ripping off Locke, which is clearly plagiarizing Locke, life, liberty, and the pursuit of estate, we're just going to call happiness. So bear with me on this, and you guys can feel free to shoot this down. So let's say I get Joe Sixpack Collins to pick up a musket, and let's say we just happen to beat the most powerful army in the world, and let's say we win. Is Joe Sixpack Collins going to expect property? Because that's what I fought for. And who has property? Oh, Thomas Jefferson has property. Well, the hell with that. I'm not going to give away my property because we know this is we're fighting this war to preserve my property. John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson, et al. So why not just put something a little more nebulous on there, like this Aristotelian idea of happiness?
Which explains the nefarious nature of this editorial change from Locke.
But I think Locke actually made the argument that the basis of happiness was property.
Right.
So there's that argument too, that he's just said it a different way. So,
Mike?
I'm just curious, does anyone remember what Mayer's, does she have a point on this? Is at any point, does this get edited, the line of happiness? Like when?
I don't remember.
I don't remember.
Do you know?
I'd have to go back and look. I don't recall Jefferson's original draft.
Right, but students, as Chris and Tim and others, you really should go to this book. It's excellent, kind of looking at what Jefferson's first draft was and how it gets edited, and it even complicates this discussion because we're attributing a lot to what Jefferson thought, and as Chris said, it was a joint effort. It complicates this idea of knowing what the founders actually wanted, what they were thinking, how they had to compromise. It makes it tangled.
Carl Becker's book does the same thing. Here's what the first draft looked like. Here were some edits. I think Becker's book is actually called The Declaration of Independence, if I'm...
I think so.
Yeah.
So the last thing I want to talk about, and I think we've touched upon the role of this foundational document in contemporary governance, and maybe we want to add to that. But I am curious, why is the Declaration seem to have more universal appeal than the Constitution? And maybe there's an obvious answer to that, and I'm just the slow student. But and maybe I've just been sold a bill of goods because I've been informed that more of the world's population is aware of the Declaration of Independence and its principles than the American Constitution. Mike, you're shaking your head.
Well, I mean, it's the classic Dodgers versus Giants kind of story, right?
What?
I mean, you have the greatest empire the world has seen up to that point, and you have this scrappy group of Rule 5 draftees with no payroll and they take down.
That's
the Brewers Cubs. That's not.
Yeah. Hey kids, I hope you have your boots on when you're listening to this because it's getting deep.
No, man, I'm being a little bit serious. I think it's a document for the underdogs. I think if I were a South African, or if I were someone in Nigeria looking to rebel against a truly corrupt governments, truly oppressive governments,
Or a kid at Tiananmen Square.
yeah, I mean, this is like, it's not just the Declaration, it's the fight that happened afterwards. I think for Americans, it's about the fight and the fireworks. Like, the Constitution is boring. This is about, we took it to them and we got our independence. We pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps, like that kind of thing.
Who forgot? Don't pay attention to those French people over there.
But to your point, most people don't.
No.
They don't know that part of the history. Like, this is where it's selective. And I don't think we have that with the Constitution. And looking comparatively, I think it's like I just said, I think it's a document for the underdogs. It's a document.
It's a sexy document. It's a sexy document compared to the Constitution, and it's aspirational.
Yeah.
Right? If we
it's sexy until you get to the list.
Yeah, you get to the list, and it's like, right. But no, I mean, I do think, it is an aspirational document, and I've heard John Kaminsky say, it's got the greatest sentence in the history of mankind, that we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, we know that Jefferson was a slave owner. We know all the warts. We know all the evil part. But if you think about that sentence as being aspirational, as the foundation for our country, and we're still striving. You see us striving to this very day with, literally millions of people in the streets trying to make sure that we're living up to that idea of equality. Mm-hmm. And it's and that, Gouverneur Morse, for the preamble, a more perfect union, the idea that we're still striving for that more perfect union that somehow matches up with that aspirational sentence in the Declaration. So you get to the nuts and bolts. It's like, who cares how old you got to be president? Who cares, that, they're going to make some courts. And, the Constitution is the rule book, right? The Declaration, or at least the ideas within the Declaration, I think are the prize.
I think I'd like to make the argument for many people, the first paragraph is important because it puts a transcendency in the narrative. You're always on good ground if you can invoke some kind of deity in your cause. So I think there's a lot of people. I mean, the second paragraph certainly is the poetry. But the first paragraph, I think, resonates with people that are more prone to think theistically about how the cosmos operates.
Yeah.
So, and kind of, I know we kind of touched on this, but I want to get back to the relevance of this document to today. Can you guys point out any time in history where there's been a consensus? I mean, well, let me ask this differently. Do you think Americans in the 21st century really believe this stuff for all Americans?
No.
That when groups have argued the Declaration of Independence, a long train of abuses, and even with the Civil Rights Movement, it wasn't like everybody went, "Oh yeah, you're right." All right. There was, massive resistance, and one might argue that, yeah, we had some legislative successes, but the fact of the matter is, at least in schools, we're more segregated today in public schools than we were in 1965. So my question is, again, these are nice platitudes. They make us feel good, like Brown makes us feel good. But in the end, Americans don't really believe these ideas except when they apply just to themselves. They're not universal ideas.
Well, this is, my easy, quick answer was no, because I've asked my students before, where the town where I used to live, and they have the community fireworks on the 4th of July celebrating. I said, now I want you to try this and see what happens. I want you to take your pocket constitutions with you. And before, the first aerial bomb goes off, I want you to stand and start reading the Declaration of Independence loudly, because that's what it was for. It was to be read aloud. And so now you're on the village green, so to speak. I want you to read this. And kids got shouted down. It's like, what do you get that out of your kid? What is that? But David, the way you reframed the question, so they came back as Mr. C, that was a terrible idea. It's like, well, What you're saying reminds me of Gunnar Myrdal and the American Dilemma.
Mhm.
You know, and the whole, and students, for you guys, it's a paper done by a Swedish sociologist that was brought in by the Carnegie Foundation in like the late 30s, early 40s to look at what he was called the Negro problem. He called it the Negro problem. He said, I couldn't call it the white people problem. I had to call it the Negro problem because it wasn't really a Negro problem. It was a problem white people have with black folks wanting to be treated equally. And he talked about the I and the we, right? So I always do this in my classes. When you look at the American flag, what does that mean to you? What are the values represented there, right? In terms of like, you know, honor, patriotism, sacrifice, opportunity, all those things, we can make that list. Now, do you believe that applies to everybody? Right? And then we talk about NIMBY, not in my backyard. You know, I think that everybody has the right to do this kind of thing, but I don't want that gay couple moving in next door to me. I don't want that Islamic couple moving next to me. I don't want that Black Lives Matter people moving in next to me, or I don't want that white cracker moving in next to me, right? So we think, when we think collectively, big scale, we're all about those values. But you know what? When I look out my window, nah.
I mean, it's in our DNA, David. I mean, hey, I have a right. I have a right. That is so much a part of our DNA. Well, that's the success of of those ideas. You know, hey, I didn't agree to that. I mean, they don't use the word consent because that's a little highbrow. But I think rights and consent and equality are fundamentally in our DNA. I think the Declaration does matter. Now, the devil's in the details, certainly. When you really start looking into that, that's where I think it's an interesting discussion. But I'd say equality, consent, and rights are just fundamentally, that's who we are, and I think that's the Declaration.
I'll agree with you on consent and rights. I do not believe equality is in our DNA. I do not.
Well,
believe that.
I don't know. My kids around the
the
dinner table always reminded me that hey, you're treating.
You know, that's not fair to the 4-year-old. That's not fair.
Yeah.
But when we get to the adults and we look at equality, our history is fraught with inequality, and that inequality in many ways is getting worse. When
White people get upset at reverse discrimination. I mean, that is equality. The devil is in the details, but I think the equality principle is really there.
Let's hear from the political scientist. I want to hear Mike's take on this.
Yeah. I think his dietary drinks kicked in because he's not looking too good.
I think you're right, actually. What was the question?
Does any of this really matter? Do we believe this? Do we believe this?
Yeah, that's right. Do we, the American people, believe this?
Jim said that rights, consent, and equality is in our DNA. And I say rights and consent might be in our DNA. I don't believe equality. You know, I mean, you can play word games with it, Tim, that it's in the details. I don't believe that we believe that all people are created equal. I just don't. I don't believe that. I don't believe that's in the human DNA because of tribalism and factionalism. You know, yeah, we believe we're equal, but if it's really going to mean something, you must have the big picture look and believe that all people are created equal. And I just don't think that's in our DNA.
I agree with you, Dave. I think that I think most Americans are much more comfortable with our natural rights tradition than our classical Republican tradition. And I think that most Americans, when they think about rights, they think about the blank slate, and they just kind of figure we're all starting at the same starting point. So yeah, we all have our rights. So I'm sorry if you've chosen to can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
If you're not what you, it's your fault. I think that's how we would articulate our belief in natural rights. And so, yeah, I think it matters to people. I don't think very many Americans really see how they're connected to others.
All right, gentlemen. I think that
Hey,
we.
before we go, I always like to share this because this is I found this out a few years back, and for the students watching, I'm going to let you in on a little something. And this is the paragraph, and maybe 4 or 5 paragraphs from the end of the document, where it says, "He has constrained our fellow citizens, taking captive on the high seas." And Timmy's heard me talk about this before, and I think this is so cool in my mind because this is where I get geeked out. They looked at Jefferson's original draft, and they used something called electral spectral analysis. I know it sounds like something out of Ghostbusters, but where they used different wavelengths of light based upon the ink, because they looked at Jefferson's original draft, and he had a different word he had used there, but he had somehow tried to cross it out or smudge it out and wrote in the word citizen. And the word he had written there, and they're using this scientific process that was way beyond my comprehension, with these different wavelengths of light. The word that he had written originally was subject. And so he changes the word subject to citizen. And in my mind, again, super nerd here, there's like, that's where he crosses the Rubicon right there. That's where this is it right here. So he's writing in his mind, and he's thinking, it's like, he's constrained our fellow subject. Wait a minute, we're not subjects. The whole idea of this is to break up with the king. As Mike said earlier, it's a breakup letter. We're out, we're out, George. We're gone, baby. And so he crosses out subjects, and he puts in the word citizen. And that's I don't know, that's like super cool. And I get real excited about that. So I wanted to share that with the students listening.
Well, I want to close and echo kind of a story that feeds off of yours about the 4th of July and the Declaration of Independence. About 20 years ago, I was dabbling as a talk show radio host, both on FM and AM, and then I was the B team who would fill in.
Wait, students, FM and AM was a way that you used to listen to podcasts. If you couldn't control when you wanted to listen to the podcast, so you had to be in your car at a certain time. Sorry, David.
No, thank you for that clarification. I forget.
Dave Richmond coming at you live on.
Yeah, and I went by the name Dave Madison, by the way. And so I was asked to fill in for the A team on the 4th of July. And so I decided to do that, Chris. I decided to read the Declaration of Independence to the audience and talk about it as the celebration of the 4th of July. And the station manager, who's actually on vacation, calls me from like 1,000 miles away. Says, "What in the hell are you doing? You're in the audience. Stop it." And I let go the next week. So anyhow, so much for that. All right, we'll see you next time, students. We're going to be talking about the state questions in Unit 2 and something about a smelly rat next time we meet. So next bat time, next bat place. We'll see you.